Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Current, founder of the Current Consulting Group, and this is another episode of Currently Speaking, the podcast of the Current Consulting Group. And I'm joined today by Yvette Farnsworth Baker, who is the senior legal consultant for the Current Consulting Group. We've done a number of webinar or podcasts and webinars, actually, for that matter, together. Welcome, Yvette, to another episode.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill. I always enjoy these talks with you.
Now, if you're interested in learning more about Currently Speaking, you can go to currentconsultinggroup.com and you can find an archive of past episodes. Like us, subscribe, you'll get notifications when new episodes of Currently Speaking come out. Become part of the growing number of people in the drug testing industry, buyers and sellers, who are following the Current Consulting Group with our podcast, Currently Speaking. Now, today's episode is going to focus on city ordinances that deal with drugs, or drugs in the workplace, I should say, and drug testing, some of them specifically with marijuana. Now, years ago, when I started this company 25 years ago, a little over 25 years now, the only two cities or municipalities that had ordinances were San Francisco and Boulder, Colorado, and they were the only two for many years. But now we're seeing more municipalities passing ordinances that would affect drugs in the workplace or drug-free workplace initiatives and drug testing. So let's start there, Yvette. What's the deal with city ordinances? How do they affect, or are they affected by a state drug testing law, for example, or federal drug testing regulations?
Sure. And they are affected by state and federal laws. There's kind of a hierarchy of what laws take precedence over others, and federal law will always take precedence over state law or local ordinance. And then comes state law, and state law takes precedence over city ordinances. But what this means is not that states or cities can't write laws or ordinances on a certain subject, but it means that if there is a conflict in the laws, the federal or the state law will take precedence over a city ordinance. Now, what is a conflict? A conflict in laws really means you can't abide by both state laws at the same time. That's a real conflict. But there are a lot of ways in which, say, a city can legislate certain issues where it's not in conflict with state or federal law. Um, but but it's just cities need to look at it really carefully. A city ordinance can't say you can't test for marijuana at all under any circumstances because federal law requires testing for marijuana in certain regulated industries. For instance, the Department of Transportation or the FAA require marijuana testing currently for certain employees. So a city can't override those federal regulations, but it can kind of fit in between those laws. Where there's not a direct conflict, and regulate things that are not specifically ruled upon by state law or federal law.
So let's take an example of a city ordinance. And I'm going to skip around a little bit, but some years ago, the city of New York enacted an ordinance where they made drug testing for marijuana in the workplace very restrictive. It was very difficult to do. And so since then, there have been guidelines or rules from the Department of Labor in the city of New York, or in the state of New York. And I'm wondering, how do those two work together, or are they in conflict with one another?
Yeah, it was a really interesting situation because I believe I'm just going off my memory for New York City's ordinance right now, but I believe New York City's ordinance prohibited marijuana testing pre employment. And at that time, um, the state did not restrict testing for marijuana. So we were really drilling down on New York City's ordinance for employers within the city and looking at, can they pre employment test for what substances? And after that passed, the New York Department of Labor passed standards that prohibit marijuana testing in New York for the vast majority of workplace testing. Not all, but for a lot of workplace testing in the entire state of New York, you now cannot conduct testing for marijuana. It didn't invalidate New York City's ordinance, but what it did was make it basically moot because the State Department of Labor standards are going to apply in New York City and outside of New York City. And the State Department of Labor standards said no pre employment testing for marijuana, which is what New York City was doing anyway.
Okay. So there's an example of not a state law per se, but rulings at the state level that maybe in this case supported and maybe even went a little bit further than the city ordinance did.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. And certain cities will be maybe more politically liberal than the state as a whole. And so maybe more um, protective of marijuana use than the state will as a whole, or will act a little faster than the state will, but the state may eventually adopt what the cities are doing. It's just interesting to watch from both the workplace drug testing industry perspective and also kind of a political perspective as well. It's interesting to see how this all plays out.
Now, some years ago, the city of Philadelphia passed an ordinance that was restrictive of employers testing for marijuana within the city boundaries. But more recently, Pittsburgh also passed a city ordinance related to marijuana. So tell us about those two and how they're either similar or different from one another.
Sure. So Philadelphia's ordinance, like you said, has been around a little bit longer. It restricts pre employment testing for marijuana. And Pittsburgh's city ordinance is brand new, and it's even more restrictive than Philadelphia's. Pittsburgh's ordinance is very unusual and very interesting. It starts out talking about protections for medical marijuana users and that employers cannot discriminate against medical marijuana patients in the workplace. We've heard that all before. That's not brand new. Um, but then the Pittsburgh Ordinance goes on to say because of this, employers cannot test for marijuana, either pre employment or within the workplace, cannot test for marijuana. And it does not specify medical marijuana. It does not specify they can't test medical marijuana patients. It applies to all employers, all employees across the board. So even though it's ostensibly about protections for medical marijuana patients, it's much, much, much more broad than that and applies to virtually all marijuana testing in the workplace. But there are some exceptions. Do you want me to talk about the exceptions right now?
Yeah, let's go through
Okay.
that.
So in Pittsburgh, like I said, you can't test applicants or employees for marijuana except number one, the easy one, federally regulated employees who have to be tested for marijuana because of, Department of Transportation or other federally regulated employees. Number two would be employees who are regulated by the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation and are required to undergo marijuana testing by Pennsylvania's Department of Transportation. Number three is positions where the employee carries a firearm. Those employees can be tested for marijuana. And then the last exception is post accident testing and reasonable suspicion testing. So those can still include marijuana testing, which I'm really glad they included that in Pittsburgh because some of the laws we're seeing lately don't include exceptions for reasonable suspicion or post accident. And it's very confusing and difficult for employers to know what to do with that. So Pittsburgh specifically allows marijuana testing post accident and reasonable suspicion and for those certain positions that I mentioned, but all other marijuana testing in the city of Pittsburgh is basically prohibited.
So that's an interesting conundrum, if you ask me. The in this case, the city of Pittsburgh passes an ordinance, enacts an ordinance that would prohibit testing for marijuana. It's very restrictive, yet there are exceptions. Now, the federal drug testing mandates, like under the Department of Transportation, whether it's FAA or FRA or Federal Motor Carrier, et cetera, that's clear, right? Because as you mentioned earlier, federal laws preempt state laws and city ordinances. So that's clear. But they also included any kind of drug testing requirements that exist under the state Department of Transportation. But then, in addition to that, there are the two exceptions that you mentioned, whether including reasonable suspicion and post-accident, right? So, do I have that straight so
Yes.
far?
And also positions where someone carries a firearm, which is not too many, but
Okay.
worth noting.
But police
Hmm.
officers, perhaps security guards, things of that nature. I guess the question that I have, and that I've always found a little bit curious, is that if we don't want people in safety-sensitive positions to be kind of free to use marijuana and be at work under the influence of marijuana without any kind of deterrence or detection, then why wouldn't it apply to other circumstances as well? And if an employer suspects or there's reasonable suspicion of somebody being under the influence of marijuana, not just an accident, but some other aberrant behavior that might suggest somebody's been using marijuana. Maybe they come back from a lunch break and they smell of marijuana. That would be a cause for reasonable suspicion. Then what it sounds like they're saying, and we've seen this in other states as well with state marijuana laws, is that there are limits to what lawmakers are willing to approve in terms of their flexibility when it comes to protecting the rights of marijuana
I
users.
know the needle just keeps getting pushed on this issue, and it's very interesting to see when is the pushing going to stop, or when is it going to move back the other direction. I mean, it's clear when they write in exceptions like this that there is an understanding that marijuana can be a dangerous drug, that there are situations where marijuana use is dangerous. But how far are we letting employees go in their marijuana use before we stop it? At this point, this kind of preventative testing is what's being outlawed. And I mean, when we talk about post accident testing, that is after something has happened. That is after, safety has been breached and there's potential injuries in a workplace because of marijuana use. I mean, is that where we want to draw the line? Only once someone is injured or an accidents happen, that's when we want to know if marijuana use is involved, or we don't want to know before that, or try to prevent things before they're happening. It's an interesting discussion to have.
Yeah, and I've been tracking studies and reports and surveys on the drug abuse issue, drugs in the workplace, drug testing for my entire career. I first got into this industry in 1989 when I was hired at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to be the staff director of what was then a new organization called the Institute for Drug Free Workplace. I later went on to become the director of that organization. And one of the first books I wrote was called Does Drug Testing Work? Because I wanted a collection of all these statistics that were being thrown around. I wanted a central source. We didn't have, the internet like we have it today. So we wrote this book and we put all the sources, all the attributions into it. And one of the studies that was in there was from the US Navy from the 1980s, like mid 1980s, 85, 87, somewhere around there. And I want to apologize to the audience because I don't remember the statistic to tell you the number, but a significant percentage of sailors in the US Navy admitted that they would return to using drugs if the Navy discontinued its random drug testing program. And so when we remove that deterrent value and effect and benefit that comes from drug testing, we get more people using drugs. It's just no way around that. And so when a city passes an ordinance that prohibits employers from pre employment screening individuals for marijuana, then they're just going to end up hiring, or it seems to me that they would end up hiring more marijuana users. And then we would see an increase potentially in post accident and reasonable suspicion drug tests, which in the city of Pittsburgh would still be allowed.
Right, right. So, you know, we're just going to have to see this play out and see, it's going to be interesting to see what the state of Pennsylvania does as a whole as time goes on, too.
Yeah, I wrote an article earlier this year, I think it was, or maybe it was last year, called Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. And so it's available on our website. But the point there is that some studies, some surveys, some reports are timeless. Some are very timely and they've got to be updated every year. The percentage of Americans who use drugs changes from year to year to year, and you want to see the latest data on that. But how employees function under the influence of marijuana is not something that changes all that much. It was bad in the 80s and 90s. It's still bad today. It's not as if drug users become better employees, safer employees now because it's
Right.
legal. No, it's still a dangerous drug. And back in the early days of my career, as I mentioned earlier, San Francisco and Boulder, Colorado were the only two city ordinances that we were aware of, that I was aware of. And I included them in the original version of Current Compliance, which is our online database of state and state drug testing laws and city ordinances that affect drug testing. But those two laws are still around, right,
Yeah.
Yvette? I mean, those are still ordinances that exist. What's unique about those compared to what we're seeing in, say, Philadelphia and Pittsburgh today?
Well, one thing that's interesting is they weren't specifically about marijuana, which is where we're really seeing the city ordinances go now, are specifically about marijuana use. And those were more about testing in general. San Francisco prohibited random or company wide testing. But this Pittsburgh ordinance, even though it's only about marijuana and not other drugs, it is far more restrictive on employers than even the San Francisco one was, which was always kind of surprising to everyone when it passed. I mean, in San Francisco, you can still test employees for marijuana use, whereas in Pittsburgh, now you can't. Um, Boulder had a lot of regulation around how testing can be conducted, but it didn't prohibit or restrict drug testing. It just regulated it using a certified laboratory, what kind of procedures you have to do to guarantee accuracy and confidentiality and those sort of things. But it wasn't prohibitive. So the way we're seeing these city ordinances go now is are very restrictive and very prohibitive, even if they're just around marijuana, but more than we've seen even with Boulder and San Francisco back in the day.
Interesting. And we did some webinars on this earlier about the new laws in California and Washington. It's interesting that California really never has had a drug testing law per se, like, say, Iowa or Minnesota, but they did pass a law that went into effect January 1st, 2024, that prohibits employers from using a drug testing method, testing employees and applicants for marijuana using a method that only reveals the psychoactive metabolite of cannabis versus the parent drug itself. And so that law would apply to the city of San Francisco,
Right.
wouldn't it?
Yes. So that law does apply to the city of San Francisco. So in San Francisco, not only are they prohibited from doing this random or company wide testing because of the city ordinance, they're also subject to the state law, which regulates what kind of methods they can use to test for marijuana. Like you said, they have to test using a method that detects the parent drug rather than using a method that detects non psychoactive metabolites, which traditionally we think of as urine testing, is what is detecting metabolites rather than the parent drug.
Yeah, which the parent drug is what's detected in an oral fluid drug
Right.
test. And so it's a completely different testing method that would be allowed in California and in the city of San Francisco when testing for marijuana. So, in conclusion, Yvette, do you see more cities passing ordinances either related to specifically to drug testing or marijuana in particular?
Yes, I think this is a trend that's going to continue, particularly in the more politically liberal cities across the country. I think we'll continue to see more city ordinances that restrict marijuana testing, and we'll keep pushing the needle and see where it stops.
All right. Thank you very much, Yvette. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this episode of Currently Speaking. If you'd like to learn more about our podcast, go to currentconsultinggroup.com. You'll find an archive of past episodes, including episodes with Yvette, talking about state drug testing laws and other issues. And like us, subscribe to us on all the major podcast platforms. You'll find Currently Speaking there, and help us build up our viewership and pass the word along. Let other people know about this. Thank you for joining us. This concludes another episode of Currently Speaking.